Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth in a series of seminar events that are being hosted by the Inland Center for Sustainable Development, also known as ICSD. ICSD is a research arm of the School of Public Policy at the University of California, Riverside. My name is Rick Bishop. I have the pleasure of being one of the staff here at ICSD. I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge some of the other staff that have helped to build this center and also develop this seminar series on the very important topic of logistics and warehousing in the Inland Empire. Dr. Ron Leveridge, a longtime faculty member at UCR, is ICSD's founder and senior advisor. Dr. Chin-Fong Wong is a professor at UCR, and she serves as the ICSD co-director. And Kristen Kopko is ICSD's principal management analyst. So we appreciate the work that they all put in. And then certainly a special welcome goes out to Dr. Mark Long. He is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at UCR. We appreciate very much the guidance and perspective that he brings to our activities. Just for a brief background, ICSD was formed in early 2020 and is intended to serve as a network center, honest broker, and resource in policy analysis on issues that impact future growth in the two inland counties, being Riverside and San Bernardino. Our focus since our inception has been how to best incorporate practices that can simultaneously address the rapid growth that's occurring in the region and also address issues related to equity and environment. If you're interested in looking at the products that have been created by ICSD since it began, we would encourage you to take a look at and visit the ICSD website, which is icsd.ucr.edu. I would also encourage you to visit the website if you have not had a chance to listen to any of the three prior panel sessions that we've had on this topic. Just as a bit more of background, this past spring, ICSD held a focus group session, which consisted and was comprised of experts in the manufacturing and logistics industry, as well as practitioners, so that we could learn more about these issues as we look to embark on developing a work program for the center that would be the focus of our work for the next year. It became clear to us after that focus group session that we had a lot more to learn. We could not create an agenda and a work program without doing more in the way of reaching out to experts on this issue. And so that's how we have developed the panel series and the sessions. As I mentioned, this is the fourth session that we've had to date. And we are really excited to have our session today with the experts that you see before you. So in September, we had a kickoff session to set the stage for further discussion. In October, we explored the impacts of the industry on pollution and public health. In November, we looked at the impacts of the industry on employment opportunities and quality of life. Today, we are very pleased to have a fantastic panel to discuss and provide perspective on transportation issues and solutions as they relate to this very important industry and the impacts that it has in the two county region. So with that, I'll take a brief moment to introduce our panelists. Then we'll get to our questions, and we'll set a few parameters for you as members of the audience as well. So first, we are very, very fortunate to have Chris Shimoda. Chris is the Senior Vice President for the California Trucking Association. Dr. Ray Wolfe is the Executive Director for the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, also known as SBCTA. Dr. Matt Miyasato is the Vice President for Strategic Growth and Government Affairs for First Element Fuel. Dr. Miyasato, thank you very much for being here. And then also Dr. Kimberly Collins, who is the Professor and Executive Director of the Leonard Transportation Center at Cal State University, San Bernardino. So that is a very, very strong panel of experts. We appreciate very much you all taking time from your busy days and your busy schedules to be with us. And then just note, if you who are in the audience, if you have questions, we have some questions for the panelists, but if you have questions or comments, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. We're not sure that we will have time to get to them. And if we do not, we will be asking our panelists to review the questions that were put into the Q&A box and respond. And we'll send those responses to you subsequent to the session. So with that, thank you again to our panelists for being with us, and let's get to it. First question, and feel free anybody to jump in, not directing any of the questions to any person. So our first question is, discuss the most important impacts of the concentration of warehousing and logistics industry on transportation in our region, Riverside and San Bernardino. Talk about, if you could, provide perspective on how your organization has direct or indirect experience with these impacts.
So Rick, can I just get started? Because I just like to show a little bit of the concentration of the movement of vehicles or medium and heavy duty vehicles within our region.
Absolutely.
I'll just share my screen real quick and then we'll be able to. So as we all know, very, very quickly, the Inland Empire is an inland port, and has a lot of the characteristics of an inland port, but also has specific port facilities. So we have the Ontario Airport, we have the major former Air Force bases that were closed. We have container ports, and we have rail. We have a number of foreign trade zones. So it's really a concentration, as well as you can see on this map, a number of major highways, state routes, interstate routes, and interstates that go through our region. And we've done a study that we're just finishing up now that's divided the Inland Empire into 6 subregions. So you see those subregions there in order to analyze the data. And I'll go through this quickly. And if anybody has any questions afterwards, I'd be pleased to talk further about it. But just really quick, looking at the aggregate bidirectional origin and destination data. So, the darker colors, higher concentrations of trips within our region. Map 1 looks at the medium duty vehicles. Map 2 is heavy duty vehicles, and map 3 is the total. And so we see, of course, in the western part of the Inland Empire, a very high concentration. But really, there are truck trips throughout our community. And this is a bidirectional looking at the medium and heavy duty vehicles with a 77-mile buffer zone from our region. And so again, we look at the medium, the heavy, and both. And you can see pretty much the same, that high concentration within the western part. And then finally, looking at some of the bidirectional from outside of the buffer zone. So really thinking about the buffer zone being regional, short distance, and then outside of the buffer zone being more long distance trips. And we see that concentration with Barstow, that red dot way up in the north area, and some additional these more of a heavy concentration with the heavy duty vehicles, of course, because these are more long distance trips. This is just looking at the dwell time. So how many trucks are resting or dwelling within the different areas. And again, it's similar data, right? We have a large concentration, but we have approximately 500,000 trucks. I think that's an accurate number from what we've researched, that are registered within the region. So we have again, that high concentration of vehicles, medium and heavy. And again, this is the average dwell time. So there's a lot of opportunities here in the transition. And as we think about zero emission vehicles for resting and for time in which charging could happen. So I just thank you for letting me take that time and just think a little bit about the truck traffic that again is within our region and what it looks like. So.
Dr. Collins, those trips, were those daily trips on those?
So the trips are for annual, so all of the trips within the area. So if we look at it, that lighter blue was very much up to 2,000 trips, and it goes up to 200,000 in certain areas. So there's higher concentrations, of course, obviously. And so it just allows us to see, and what we're looking towards is to think about opportunity charging. And as we do transition, and if there is an electric portion of the fleet as it goes into zero emission, what are those opportunities for charging? Like looking at, how long are they resting, and where could there be connections that an alternative fuel generation design could happen for the Inland Empire. So it's thinking within those characteristics.
Hey, Rick, let me, oh, I beat you to the punch there, Ray, but I'll be quick. Dr. Matt Miyasato, First Element Fuel. So we are the leading market retail hydrogen station provider. So I'm hopeful that Dr. Collins, that your research will also incorporate some shorter dwell times for hydrogen refueling, right? So that the intent is to provide a diesel-like fueling experience for the trucks that, largely don't exist yet, but we know that many are being worked on as we speak. So, with respect to the question that, Rick, you would ask, what's the impact on the large concentration warehousing and transportation in the region on, in particular, my company, my industry, is we hope it's going to have a profound impact, right? We are really betting on the market and the manufacturers stepping up to provide zero emission vehicles, in particular medium and heavy duty trucks, to meet not only the ARB regulatory framework that they have, where all drayage trucks have to be zero emissions by 2036, as well as all light duty vehicles, but also there's more classes of vehicles that have to be zero emissions that are being phased in, which is really going to affect Chris's membership. But we're hopeful that a large number of those will be fuel cells because they don't require the long recharging times or the heavy payload that are accompanying battery electric trucks. So we are looking forward to providing some of that zero emission transportation sector with hydrogen fuel. You're up, Ray.
I think Chris is chomping at the bit, but
Go
so I'll let
ahead,
you go
Ray.
first, and then I'll finish up.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, just first off, wanted to thank UCR for the invitation to participate. I really appreciate it. So Chris Shimoda, Senior Vice President of the California Trucking Association, and just a little bit of background about the CTA. We got about 1,000 members, all facets of the trucking industry. Everything from your Fortune 500 companies down to single truck operators. Our average member is a 20 truck fleet, typically multi-generation owned, owned and operated here in California. And so, when I look at Dr. Collins's map, I like to think about the why. Number one is, the Inland Empire is really the economic hub of the logistics industry because of, I'd say, two factors. Number one, the proximity to the nation's largest port complex, the ports of LA and Long Beach, where 40% of international trade comes into the United States, generates 1 in 9 jobs estimated in Southern California. And the Inland Empire is really part of that nexus to that port complex, in addition to the fact that, you've got one of the largest population centers in the United States in Southern California. So it's really just a factor of proximity to the ports of LA and Long Beach, and really logistics to service, a massive population in Los Angeles, Orange, and Riverside and San Bernardino counties. So, since the issue already got brought up on zero emissions, and Dr. Miyasato is correct that, we really do have, I think, some unresolved questions about how we're going to get to some of these new technologies. And the reason why I say that is when I see the concentration of trucks on that map, I immediately start doing the math on kilowatt hours. I am not an electrical engineer, but I feel like I've gone to electrical engineering school over the last year, learning about what it's really going to take to, if we go down the path of electrification, transition all of these trucks, and 500,000 sounds about right. There's around 400,000 Class 8 trucks in the state at any given time, about 2 million Class 2B, which is like your classic parcel delivery van, up to your Class 8 big rigs. And so when you start really digging into what that's going to take, I'll just let the audience know, fastest charging available, widely at this point is around a 350 kilowatt charger. 3 trucks on 350 kilowatt chargers were around a megawatt. That's about 1,000 households worth of electricity use going through those 3 chargers. And so, the recurring theme in these forums that we've been doing lately in the Inland Empire, I'd really just go back to investment. It's all about infrastructure. I know Dr. Wolfe's going to be talking about physical road infrastructure. Do not discount what it is going to take to get that charging infrastructure in place. When you say, okay, we're going to put the charger in this particular location, that charger feeds back into a distribution and transmission network for the electrical grid, in any given investor-owned utility territory, that when you start needing to bring the kind of electricity that we're talking about here into an area, you could really be talking about a very long time and in the tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment to do that. And so I'm just going to, probably say this multiple times during the session. This is really an infrastructure and investment issue. And if nothing else, I really want the audience to come away saying we need to champion the region. If it's going to be the hub of logistics and goods movement, servicing the nation's, needs for consumer goods, the Inland Empire deserves the investment to support what it's going to take to get some of these things done.
Just a quick follow-up question there, Chris, or for any of the other panelists. So, that's a tremendous potential drain on the grid, to meet these requirements in the future. And so the obvious question to me is, does the, to what extent is our local and regional utility player, in this case, Southern California Edison, how are they considering the, the need for this, the impacts for this, the planning for this, the spending for this? Is it a scenario and a situation that can be met in the future, or are there gaps and holes that need to be met through other means, such as those suggested by Dr. Miyasato?
I'm gonna give Dr. Miyasato a plug. I think that hydrogen is absolutely going to be in the mix moving forward. He can definitely do the pitch as for why, but I'd say this about the readiness for this transition. If I went to electrical engineering school this year, so here's some of what I learned. So let's say you've got a trucking company located in Chino, California, at a specific address. So that company is serviced by the utility on a specific circuit that feeds back into very specific distribution infrastructure, probably through a substation up to transmission infrastructure back to the power generation point. And when you look at, it's not just Southern California Edison, but all of the investor-owned utilities in the state. There is some information that the Energy Commission has presented that each of the circuits around the state from the investor-owned utilities, they are mostly maxed out, and that's by design, right? The electrical grid is not really designed to carry a ton of additional what's called integration capacity at any of these individual circuits. And so in order to update that particular trucking company's infrastructure and their neighbors, by the way, because most of these facilities tend to be co-located in the same area, There really is a massive undertaking that needs to occur behind the chargers in order to make that happen. And, just the reality is it's basically each individual trucking company is going to be like, the electricity demand of a large industrial facility. It's going to be new demand on the order that I would venture to guess that the utilities have not seen, up to this date. And so it's going to be a real, challenge. That's all I can say.
Yeah, and Rick, let me just add quickly because I don't want to belabor the point, but so I spent the last 2 decades at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. I was as chief technologist. We funded tons of electric truck and vehicle projects. And as Chris was saying, one of the major hurdles was installing the infrastructure just to deploy 10 trucks, 5 trucks, 20 trucks. And those, there's some trucks now that I understand that projects that I started when I was there 2 years ago that still have not gotten the infrastructure. So, my plea in my current role is that there's going to be room for both. But I think I really like what Chris said is that there needs to be investment in the infrastructure for the region in order to make both of those reality, both electric and hydrogen.
Yeah, and Rick, just really quick, there is a full plan that Edison has put together to look at increasing the supply of energy throughout our region. But I think it's even more complex than that, and I won't, completely belabor this, but there's more than just Edison. I mean, there are multiple, publicly owned utilities within our region, in addition to Edison, and it's a complex area to enter as each of these different utilities are trying to meet the needs of their customers. So it is very difficult. And I agree. I think we only looked at EVs because that was sort of the charge of the grant that we got, but it's going to be a mix, obviously, of hydrogen and electric. And I think the main issue right now is it's just like, people say we're in the wild, wild west, and people are trying to figure out, okay, how do they get into compliance? Because people want to be in compliance, companies want to be in compliance, but it's very difficult to figure out how to do that because of the complexity of the transition, the number of actors and stakeholders that are within the transition, the number of technologies that are out there, and companies have to think, okay, am I spending, $5 million? I know that's not a lot, but within this transition, but I'm going to put $5 million out there on the table. Am I buying the right equipment? So it's something that needs to be talked about a lot more within our community. And I agree with Chris. We need a lot more investment to see this happen from multiple levels.
So let me talk, there's really 2 issues, and we've talked a lot about one, and that is related to the air quality side of the equation, right? So we saw the maps, the concentration of trucks generates significant pollution, right? But the concentration, the first question that was posted in the Q&A, part of the question was, what are the benefits to the region? And there are tremendous benefits. Chris touched on these briefly, but there are tremendous benefits to our local economy because this industry brings jobs to our local economy, to the regional economy, that is the greater LA basin, the state economy, and the national economy. I often point to the fact that the Inland Empire, and particularly San Bernardino, is the gateway to America when it comes to containerized freights. The ports of LA and Long Beach are the gateway to the Asian marketplace. And I think that's important. But in addition to the air quality concerns that we're grappling with right now, and we've got legislated mandates that Matt was talking about a little bit, we also have, even once that's been solved, we also have a tremendous problem with congestion. So we are going to have trucks, whether they're internal combustion engine trucks or whether they're zero emission trucks, hydrogen, electric, battery electric, whatever that is, but they're still going to be on the roadways. And so we still and this is the area where my agency steps in, we still have to figure out how we build the capacity that's necessary to move these goods. Now, part of the answer may be moving more of these goods by rail, right? And there's conversations surrounding that right now. But as we heard earlier, a lot of these goods are actually intended for our local marketplace. It's the things that we buy day in and day out, right? And so not all of that can be resolved by shipping it via rail to a destination outside of the greater LA basin. So we're still going to have to address the highway capacity element. The other problem we have is, while we saw there's a concentration in this area, that concentration is actually widely distributed. So you drive through the city of Ontario, through Chino, through Mira Loma, and on, all of these communities have embraced warehousing and logistics. And so it's not like we have this 1 square mile area where it's all concentrated, right? We've got to be able to move those goods to and from those facilities and the ports. And then we all expect goods to be delivered to our front door, right? So that exasperates it even more. We're not all going to Target or Walmart or whatever. We're now expecting goods to be delivered to our front door. And so that adds to compounds our problem. The challenge that we are facing right now is the state of California and to some extent the federal government as well are shying away from investing in highway capacity projects. And so that leaves our communities sort of stuck with growing congestion because the state and federal government continue to invest in the ports, investing in modernization of the ports, investing in and increasing the throughput of the ports. Increasing the throughput of the ports does nothing but add more containerized goods moving through our region. And that's not a bad thing, right? But it's a challenge that we have to face up front. We can't ignore that fact. We can't celebrate increasing throughput at the ports and ignore that those goods have to move through our communities to warehouse and logistics facilities where maybe only half of those goods are actually going to be absorbed within our communities. The rest of it's going to marketplaces outside of California. So there's a tremendous challenge and there's a breakdown in the policies and the legislation at the state and federal level that we really need to address. This is hitting close to home with a challenge we're having with the California Transportation Commission as we speak, when they denied funding over $200 million of funding to add capacity on Interstate 15 between Riverside County and San Bernardino County. We'll get that resolved, but it speaks to the broader policy challenge that we face.
Ray, do you think those decisions are made largely with commuters in mind and the issue of, you know, freight and distribution and warehousing and logistics takes a backseat to that, or is there something else going on?
No, I think commuters aren't top of mind either, because the state is really trying to figure out how to house the population, right? So that's another element of this. And the population is starting to migrate more and more inland. And yet the job centers remain largely in the coastal counties. There's been some migration of that as well, but remain largely. And so those that are still going to the office on a daily basis are still finding themselves driving long distances. So when you couple that with the growth in the containerized freight sector, you've got, you're just compounding the problem even more, right?
You briefly touched on the issue that rail might be a solution and there's some potential for expansion of rail. So to what extent is that occurring and what kind of expansions can occur? I'm sure there must be, you know, pretty significant infrastructure investment that would be necessary for that to occur as well, or would there?
Oh, absolutely. There'd be tremendous costs in doing that. But I think those costs would probably be less than the costs of continuing to widen freeways to the extent that's going to be necessary to meet the what I like to term the insatiable demand, both at the local and national level for foreign goods right now. So I think we need to be careful that the goods that are received at the ports that are identified for marketplaces outside of California, those certainly can be moved differently than they are today, right? To another destination. And there's a conversation about the Barstow Intermodal Gateway with BNSF Railway, but making sure that we aren't using rail to move containers to a facility like that and then trucking it back down to the existing warehouse and logistics facilities that exist here in the greater Inland Empire and the LA basin, because that would defeat the purpose, right? So the challenge is making sure that you're moving the goods that are destined for marketplaces outside of California via rail to a hub somewhere outside of the greater LA basin. But those goods that are intended for consumption or manufacturing in the greater LA basin, they need to remain here.
And this is actually a great topic. I know, I think TRB just met maybe this last week, and this is an academic audience, so someone will probably fact check my statement here. So, but please do. I know that most of the research on mode shift suggests that, you know, there's really very specific commodities that can be shifted from truck to rail. And, you know, something important to know about the industry is that, you know, amongst our membership, we have some of the largest intermodal carriers in the country who very gladly put cargo on rail and then truck it the final mile within their logistics networks. You know, it is really an interdependent system between ocean, rail, and trucking. And I don't think, and I would love to see some research in this area, I don't think you're going to be able to mode shift your way out of the kind of investments that you're suggesting, Ray. It's really not if we just focus on getting more trucks off the road by investing in rail, suddenly the trucks go away. It's sort of a both and approach, increasing rail capacity, but also, you know, I know Dr. Miyasato and I spent a long time talking about, you know, air quality and his capacity at South Coast AQMD. You know, we really are always on, you know, from an air quality standpoint, a constant progress towards getting better. But it really will shock you if you're from that sort of thinking, how we can look at heat maps on congestion moving into the future, just getting worse and worse. And people are willing to just stick their head in the sand and say, well, we're just not going to invest in highways anymore. You know, I've spoken to people who, you know, have been very high up in Caltrans and other, you know, places in the past. I do think there's some negative connotation with, you know, things that have been done in the past on capacity expansion. I think people realize a lot of that, you know, is sort of a relic of the past. But we need to figure out a way that, I know when we were involved in SB1 and getting more infrastructure dollars from the state to help out on these issues, it really is a function of, we've got infrastructure that was built in the 1940s and 50s that is in dire need of repair. Bridges that are, you know, D-rated, you know, D and C rated by people that look at the health of those structures that need to be replaced. You know, safety projects, smart capacity expansion, right? Not just capacity for the sake of doing so. And really, you know, we need to be able to have those conversations, because the population's not going to stop growing. People are not stopping purchasing things online. These are, you know, sort of good governance conversations that need to occur around infrastructure investment.
Yeah, and Chris, I completely agree. I do think that moving some containerized goods by rail will help us, but I think the help will be temporary because of that growth in containerized goods. The ports of LA and Long Beach are operating at a third of their capacity or less right now. Imagine when they operate at full capacity someday, right? So we need a holistic approach, but that approach needs to include investment in highways, which is the struggle we're having as an organization, because it's a responsibility of ours in San Bernardino County, at least. And the state is not a willing partner in that conversation right now.
So, yeah, so those comments, you know, it really begs this question is, you know, population is growing, so, trips are on the increase. The trucking industry, trips are growing as this industry also grows. You've got state and federal agencies that are reluctant, as you mentioned, Dr. Wolfe, to fund capacity enhancements. So one of the questions in the Q&A is, is one of the answers to maybe invest in public transit to get commuters off the road? Is that something that can be successful in a region such as ours? Or, something's got to give. And so where is it going to be?
So let me take that first, again, because that's a responsibility of my agency. And, I think we've all read the news, we've all heard the reports or seen the reports. Public transit is not functioning very well right now, post-COVID, right? We were actually on a fairly good trajectory prior to COVID, but we're just not rebounding across the board to the extent that's necessary. Public transit is not cheap. Right? Highway investment's not cheap either, but public transit's not cheap. And so the third thing that I want to point out is, while San Bernardino County and Riverside County and other inland counties are growing rapidly, we still don't have the density to support the type of frequency of service that's really going to be attractive. So my agency is doing a lot of different things in the public transit area, recognizing that if we can get some people out of their cars, that will help. But until we get to a point where we've got densities that support high frequency service, we're simply not going to move the ball in that arena. So we're laying the groundwork today, recognizing that that's going to be a solution well into the future. And it's not going to really be a solution until that density really increases substantially. And there's lots of land in the Inland Empire right now. And so we're just not seeing the density that's going to be necessary to get to that point.
Dr. Wolfe, is telecommuting, which has picked up pretty significantly since COVID, has that made a dent in trips?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think, I don't know what the rates are right now, but a couple of years ago, Metrolink reported that the office space usage in downtown LA was somewhere around 40%, right, of pre-COVID numbers. And so that translates very clearly to people not using transit to move in and out of downtown LA, right? And so people are telecommuting. In my office, people come in 2 to 3 days a week, and I think that's fairly traditional now. And that means there's a lot fewer trips that are being made. However, that's affected the public transit side of things more than highway commuting or highway driving. So if you notice, you drive on the 91 freeway, you drive on the 57, you drive on the 710, you drive on the 605, the 10, the 210, whatever freeway that you drive on, congestion today is probably worse than it was pre-COVID. And yet nobody's taking the bus and nobody's taking the train. So these are people that supposedly are working from home, but are they working from home? What are they doing? Because they're in their cars and they're driving somewhere.
The secret's out. So, okay, well, that's a great response. So the next question, we've maybe touched upon this a little bit, but, as the warehousing and logistics industries have grown and we've seen this rise in online shopping and people using that, what transportation measures and policies have really been enacted to address that? And maybe at the local and regional level first, and then maybe Ray and Dr. Collins, you guys can also speak to the state and federal.
Well, if I can just start, I mean, there's going back, if we go back to the Clean Air Act of 1970, I mean, between the federal, the state, and looking at regional policies today, we have probably 125 different pieces of legislation, executive orders, rules and regulations and standards that come out of agencies that are within the region and that have to be met, and are directing companies within this case for compliance. So again, it's a very complex arena within the policy framework. And there's been a number of programs that are created by the public and the private sector, particularly JETSI and then the E-Truck RETA program that are really looking to be, to provide prototypes and to show how it can be done and how it can work. There's been a lot of work that's happened within public transit, because they were mandated first with the bus and truck rule to really start to transition before industry. So we've seen some of the balances, particularly with Foothill Transit as a case study, and in trying to go electric and then moving to hydrogen and now trying to deal with some of the issues of hydrogen. So it's I think we have a fairly robust policy framework out there, where I see it as the state has really tried to create a market around zero emission vehicles, create that supply as well as the demand portions of it. The questions are, in the implementation, and there's a lot of uncertainty on how the implementation is going to happen. So, there's a lot of questions out there. If you think about, we're going to have additional congestion, and if a lot of the trucks do go electric, we know that those trucks weigh more than current medium or heavy duty vehicles. So what is that going to mean about the quality of the highway system? Are we going to have to put additional infrastructure in to be able to deal with those weight capacities? So there's a lot of questions out there, as we can see. And I think that these forums, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it's important to have more of these forums, more conversations, and bring more experts to the table to really talk about the multitude of issues that are out there and some of the negative externalities that could happen within communities. So I'll leave it at that. But I think we have a good policy framework. I just don't know if it's clear on how it's and how it's going to be implemented or how it's moving forward.
Yeah, and let me just add a shout out to my previous agency, right? So the indirect source rule for warehousing was a big effort that was undertaken as a regional regulatory action to try to mitigate any emissions from the burgeoning warehouse industry, as you had mentioned, Rick. So it was rather innovative. I was not involved with that rulemaking. I was really on the technology side, so don't blame me if you're under that rubric. But one thing it did provide is the potential for incentives, right? So the warehousing companies could either do mitigation on their own by buying electric trucks or zero emission trucks and getting credit for that, or they could pay into a fund that then could be used to provide for greater infrastructure and more zero emission vehicles. So there was kind of this menu driven kind of compliance mechanism, which was pretty novel, I think, in terms of trying to solve a problem. I think it's yet to be seen if it's going to be successful. But that's as Dr. Collins is saying, there is some frameworks out there that are trying to crack that nut.
Yeah, and I'd like to deliver some good news, on this front. I'm going to date myself by saying, I've been with the CTA for 16 years at this point, and I was involved in the implementation of the California Truck and Bus Rule, which was part of something that, for those of you who go way back, the Diesel Risk Reduction Plan in the state of California, which was, I think, 2002, where originally the state of California's goal was to regulate, basically every piece of diesel equipment in the state of California. And they rolled out over a period of time a suite of rulemakings that the goal back in 2002 was to reduce diesel particulate matter by 80% statewide. And the good news is the manufacturers innovated. They came up with some really incredible control technology, things like diesel particulate filters, selective catalytic reduction, that exceeded, if you talk about proximity risk to emissions, you're really talking about diesel particulate matter, PM2.5. Those emissions have been reduced by over 99%. It's actually like 99.99% when that filtration system is working correctly. On the NOx side, which is, especially in a region like the Inland Empire, the precursor emission for ozone and smog, those emissions have been reduced in the existing trucks by over 90%. There are both state and federal standards that are going to do around another, like, let's call it 85% reduction on top of that. And so the good news is from what we call criteria pollutants, exhaust out criteria pollutants, we're more or less there on solving the issue. Now, the challenge in front of us is really what we've been talking about on zero emissions. That's more of a global climate change concern. It is not, at least at this point in time, readily apparent how we're going to get there. And I think that is the major question moving forward. This is not, simply a question of we're going to add after treatment onto an internal combustion engine and there's nothing fundamentally changing about the vehicle or the industries that utilize the technology. We're really talking about, this is more akin to the transition from the horse and buggy to the internal combustion engine than it is from an uncontrolled engine to a controlled engine. And so, just want folks to recognize this is actually, we're living through a real period of history right now that, a lot of things about logistics are going to fundamentally change along with this transition. And it's going to be a question of, how much of that can really occur without, major disruption to everyone's daily lives. And, you see a truck on the road, but just keep in mind, trucking is really construction and housing. It's food. It is, your everyday daily needs being delivered to your doorstep. It is supplies for hospitals to perform surgeries. It's the fuel in your car. It is basically ubiquitous throughout our lives. And it's really only when there is a shortage of toilet paper, during COVID and the supply chain crisis that people really start remembering. I mean, this is just fundamental to everybody's daily life. So, it's an unsolved problem. The criteria pollutant problem, thankfully, we're way down the road on solving that issue. The transition to zero emissions, we're really not there. And it's going to be, probably the challenge of definitely the rest of my career. I can tell you that much.
Although we're still not in attainment, Chris, right?
Boy, we probably need like 3 hours on ozone attainment, but yeah, I mean, that I gotta just say, it is disheartening to see, let's just say less response to NOx reductions than we were hoping, at the time. And, I'll leave it to your former colleagues at the AQMD to try to figure out, what the right, chemistry mixes and technology mixes, because, we're running out of NOx to reduce, but, still seeing some pretty serious ozone issues.
Yeah, I agree. We're not at attainment, but the technologies are still evolving. I think, Matt, as you were pointing out earlier, hydrogen is likely to be a key fuel of the future, right? But when you look at whether it's hydrogen or electric charging stations, we don't have the infrastructure anywhere near. You drive your internal combustion diesel or gasoline powered vehicle, every other corner has a gas station. We have to get to that point or close to that point for this transition to really happen. And I think it's exciting that the state at all levels and the federal government now is investing to try to help us to get there. So that infrastructure needs to be in place. And then we've got to figure out how we transition the fleet itself. And there's huge challenges that Chris and his organization are looking at. And there's tremendous challenges on the rail side of the equation as well.
Yeah, I thought I seen an article recently that the feds were investing close to $700 million in EV infrastructure, but on the counter, the governor of California recently announced about $3 billion in potential cuts from climate change kinds of actions to help balance the budget deficit. Are any of those cuts, any of you had a chance to look at those cuts and find out whether or not it impacts this issue that's important to us?
Yeah, we're still parsing through the data, but you know, depending on if you view a deferral of funding to a future year to a cut, we're looking at around 370 million between vehicle and infrastructure funding being cut. And you know, the budget process is just getting started. You have governor's budget in January, May revise, and then the budget needs to be delivered by June. I think that is going to be a question, is as we're trying to ramp up efforts to get to zero emissions, what sort of message does it send that the state is cutting, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of that sort of investment? So, you know, it is just a reflection of this is not going to be easy in any way, shape, or form. I did see the announcement of 600 million from the federal government. We're going to need, I can confidently say, just for the charging equipment itself, not the utility side infrastructure, in the tens of billions in California alone, just for the trucking. So 638 million nationally. I mean, it just gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about, right? So, you know, again, it's something that I anticipate, you know, I'm probably working another 25 years minimum. I probably am going to be working on nothing but this the rest of my career.
Okay, good. Hey, about 10 minutes left, panel, and you probably are taking a look at some of the questions that are coming into us in the chat, and they're really good questions. And as I mentioned, we'll ask our panelists to respond, and we'll get those to you. But let's just kind of move to strategies. I mean, obviously, you know, the big issue is funding, whether it's funding for the infrastructure that's necessary to clean the fleets, to the infrastructure necessary to move the goods. You know, funding is obviously the big issue for us and the region. So, you know, maybe each of you could take a few minutes to talk about what you would recommend that is needed to address this issue, and maybe also to what extent, you know, to what extent is collaboration occurring or not occurring? I mean, ports are involved, the trucking associations involved, clean air advocates are involved, transportation agencies are involved, the state and federal governments should be involved. Local jurisdictions, there are a lot of players that have a high stake in this, and to what extent are they all communicating or not? So everybody take a few minutes and give us your thoughts on how to solve this issue.
Well, let me go first, because I'll have very rudimentary thoughts and probably not as deep as the other panelists, but I do want to comment on something that Dr. Wolfe had mentioned is trying to get to the, you know, emulating the petroleum gasoline station model. I don't think that's necessary, right? I mean, you really don't need a gas station on every single corner and intersection, right? That it's there could be substantially less fueling infrastructure to provide for, you know, fuel cell vehicles as we progress. So we think it's potentially overbuilt in terms of what the gasoline stations offer. So you wouldn't have to exactly emulate that model. But with respect to what's kind of needed to solve the problem, that may be in the too hard pile in terms of, you know, how to get to that solution in this webinar. But just a couple thoughts that I would offer up is one, at least for hydrogen, right? For a zero emission technology, it's really in a nascent phase, right? It's just starting. So there's been a lot of discussion about putting some restrictions on how it's produced, right? Only, you know, renewable electrolytic hydrogen is kind of what a lot of the environmental groups are pushing for. And that's really going to just increase the cost and make it non-viable. So, you know, just as with any starting technology that's trying to get off the ground, is let's not over hamstring it with different restraints. Let's make sure the market takes off before we fully engage in having it come from, you know, renewable resources only. The second thing I would just say, Rick, and I think is having these local governments involved. So this webinar is a great beginning to that. Is having these jurisdictions like cities, municipalities, regional agencies such as the South Coast and others, and like Ray's group, is really being aware of all of these policy issues and then trying to work together. So exactly what you're trying to do here at the School of Public Policy. So I think it's kind of on the right track, is just getting the right folks together.
Great comments.
Yeah, so just to build off of that, because I agree. I think it is funding, but in some ways, you can see you could have all the funding in the world and sometimes things still don't work. And as a social scientist, a lot of it comes about with communication. And that's one of the hardest things I think we have as, human beings, trying to figure out how to communicate, how to educate, how to get the information out there. Another issue that, even though there are a lot of projects, again, that JETSI project, the eTruck Retta project, you see the public and the private sectors working together. You see that there's funding for community-based organizations. There's a lot of movement, and it goes down to, I think I've said it too many times now, but really the complexity, and even for individuals to be able to understand everything that's happening. It's very difficult, right? There's almost too much information to be able to capture and to understand what does this mean. And so I think in addition to having funding, yes, it's important, but we also need to really establish ways to communicate better with each other. We need to really think about the workforce development and the workforce training issues, because that's a serious issue for us, particularly as you look into the transition. And Chris will probably know this better than I. I'm almost sure of it. But if you look at the number of independent operators or companies that are in the Inland Empire, I have a real concern. I mean, in thinking about if we start to move this into a social equity conversation and look at our disadvantaged communities, which a lot of the Inland Empire is considered disadvantaged. So there's disadvantage that comes with living along truck routes and having environmental contamination and environmental justice there. But there's also these issues with this transition. In the past, a lot of these independent operators were able to buy used diesel vehicles that came from business models where the larger fleets would recycle out some of their trucks that were a few years older, put them out so that the independent operators could buy them for like $125,000. Those trucks now are $400,000, $500,000. It's not clear to me how we're going to be helping all of the disadvantaged communities if they all lose their jobs, and families are really gonna be hurting. So we need to look at all of these different complex issues, I guess, going back to, Dr. Miyasato. I mean, I don't know if we can solve it all right here, right now, because there's so many different components to this transition that need to be looked at. So I'm going to make a pitch. I know I'm a university professor, but we need more research and we need more conversations, and we need to think how we can work across silos, because we all are experts within our own area. How do we bring these multidisciplinary conversations together? And Rick, I think you're doing a great job with this series, and it's been one step forward in accomplishing that piece.
Go ahead, Ray.
Chris, go ahead, or Chris, and Ray.
Okay, so since we're running out of time, I'll just say, we collaborate when we can with any partner that wants to bring investment. I think that the fundamental disagreements are on where we are in this technology development and where the technology is going to be economical. And to Dr. Collins's point, in order for single truck owner operators, family-run companies, whomever, I mean, the economics are the same for everybody. In order for this technology to thrive, it has to be able to serve its intended function in a way that allows the company to be profitable so that it can pay its workers, reinvest back into the community. Trucking is one of the last blue-collar industries in the state of California, one that, if you talk to John Hughes and others, he'll tell you, is, again, one of the best paying jobs you can get without a college education. And so we really do need to be, I think, patient with the development of this technology, because it works in certain applications, final mile delivery with overnight charging, depot-based, yard tractors, but in many other applications, there is no solution. And so, we look forward to having those dialogues, even if it looks like we're outwardly fighting with public entities. Believe me when I say we're in constant dialogue about how this transition can be successful. And that's, I think, what everybody wants, is successful transition in a way that, everyone's needs and concerns are looked after.
Great comments, Chris. Thanks.
I'm gonna give you a 2-second because I know it's 5 o'clock. I think we need to allow technology to evolve in certain areas, because without those technological advances, hydrogen, I think, is going to be key, but we're still far behind the 8 ball on that. We're not going to meet our goals. And in fact, I would argue we're not going to meet the goals that are legislated at this point. And we're going to have to do everything we can to try to push the envelope. And so getting near zero technologies out on the street today, I think, is important, because it helps us get closer with keeping the eye on the long-term goal of getting to zero emission. Focusing as we are now on building out the fueling infrastructure, the charging infrastructure at key locations, as Matt pointed out, I think is going to be essential as well. But we have a long haul ahead of us, and we are not going to make the 2035, 2036 date, the 2040 date. But we got to do everything we can to get as close as we can.
It's going to be tough, that's for sure. Well, this was a great session, very insightful. I wish we could go longer. It reminds me, I think this quote is attributable to, or attributed to, Winston Churchill, when he once said something to the extent of, "We've run out of money, and so we're going to have to think." And that's kind of where we are right now. Is there's a lot of collaboration that needs to occur, and this is a really good start. So let me, Chris Shimoda, Dr. Ray Wolfe, Dr. Kimberly Collins, Dr. Matt Miyasato, thank you so much for joining us. You really have helped us and hopefully members of the audience, and we appreciate that very much. As we mentioned before, a lot of good questions came in during the Q&A. We're going to farm those out to you, and hopefully you can take a stab at them, and then we can send them to those that RSVP'd and participated in the event. So again, on behalf of UCR School of Public Policy and the Inland Center for Sustainable Development, thank you, panelists, for being part of this. Thank you to all the attendees that were with us as well. So we'll see you next time. Remember, a reminder, our next session is on February the 7th, and we will be sending information out to you all then. All right, thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks.